TikTok most under 40s are using. It's
What is it?
side chick, and
Oh,
it is
no.
Queen Camilla
You
is the
did
ultimate
not
side
know.
What
chick.
does that mean?
Persevering. It means if you are the third woman who's hung on long enough, he will change and he will.
Camilla's garden shed seemed ordinary, quiet, tucked away, forgotten. But when its doors creaked open, what lay inside was anything but harmless. Shadows concealed a disturbing secret, one that should never have been hidden on royal grounds. What they uncovered was not just unsettling. It was dangerous, enough to ignite whispers of fear and scandal across the palace.
Huge pleasure to welcome you all, writers, publishers, and book lovers, to Clarence House. A week late, but COVID-free. So thank you very much for rejigging your busy diaries and coming to.
Once revealed, there was no turning back. Camilla had lived in the village for several decades. She was known to most as a solitary figure who kept mostly to herself. Though she wasn't unfriendly, she rarely engaged with the community. Some people referred to her as eccentric, others as simply private. She was a regular face at the local market, but always kept conversations short, her eyes often shifting nervously, as if the world outside of her home was a place she couldn't fully engage with. Over the years, people stopped asking too many questions about her, and she became somewhat of a mystery. Her house was situated on the outskirts of the village, just on the edge of the small forest that bordered the town. A charming cottage with ivy creeping up its stone walls, and an overgrown garden that seemed to have a life of its own. In many ways, Camilla's house mirrored her life, secluded, slightly overgrown, but always looking as though it had been carefully tended to, even if no one could remember exactly when the last time she had spoken to someone. The garden shed, tucked away at the far end of her property, was an extension of her retreat from the outside world. To most, it was just another shed used for storing garden tools and old boxes. No one thought much about it, not even the curious children who occasionally dared to peek over her fence to get a glimpse of her world. The shed stood as a symbol of the quiet life Camilla led, ordinary to the outside observer, but filled with an unseen world to those who had reason to wonder. The first signs that something was amiss came when a neighbor, Mrs. Eliza Brooks, noticed that Camilla hadn't been out to her garden in several days. Mrs. Brooks, who lived 2 houses down, had always taken the time to greet Camilla when their paths crossed. It was rare, but occasionally they exchanged pleasantries over the fence or during walks through the village. When Mrs. Brooks hadn't seen Camilla for several days, she thought it odd, but not alarming. After all, Camilla had always been someone who preferred her privacy. Still, she decided to check on her, something she had done in the past when Camilla had fallen ill. On the morning of the discovery, Mrs. Brooks made her way over to Camilla's home, knocking gently on the door. When no one answered, she knocked again, this time louder. After several attempts and no response, Mrs. Brooks grew concerned. She checked the windows, but the house appeared dark, and no movement was visible inside. It was then that she decided to call the local authorities, fearing that something might have happened to her neighbor. When the authorities arrived, they found the front door locked, and there was no sign of life inside the house. However, the garden shed at the rear of the property was slightly ajar. That's when the investigation began. At first, it seemed like a simple matter. Perhaps Camilla was unwell or had gone on an unexpected trip. But the sight of the shed, which had been left open just a crack, piqued the interest of the officers. The officers, along with a few trusted village personnel, approached the shed cautiously. It was a small structure, no bigger than a typical garden tool storage space, but it held an undeniable air of mystery. The door creaked as it was pushed open, and the dim light that filtered through the small gap cast eerie shadows across the space. The contents inside were not what anyone had expected. There were no neatly stored gardening tools, no bags of compost, nor neatly stacked flower pots. Instead, what they found inside that garden shed would be enough to send shockwaves through the village. As the door swung open, the officers were met with a scene that felt both surreal and unsettling. Piles of old tarps and crates were scattered across the floor. At first glance, it appeared to be nothing more than an accumulation of years of clutter. perhaps left by Camilla in a moment of disorganized chaos. However, beneath the debris, a small makeshift bed had been set up, complete with tattered blankets and a pillow, clearly showing signs of long-term use. What was even more disturbing was the presence of several large weathered boxes stacked in one corner of the shed, almost as if they had been purposefully hidden away. As the team began to sift through the contents, they found that the boxes weren't just full of discarded trinkets. They contained personal items, items that didn't seem to fit the image of a reclusive woman leading a simple life. Among the scattered papers, journals, and old photographs, there were letters, handwritten and addressed to various recipients, though most were unopened. The most unsettling discovery, however, was a small wooden chest, secured tightly with a rusty lock. The chest was tucked away in the farthest corner of the shed, almost as if Camilla had gone to great lengths to conceal it. The chest was carefully pried open, and inside, the contents were both bizarre and revealing. The box was filled with various personal mementos, some relating to Camilla's past, some more recent. But the most unexpected find was a series of journals dating back several years. The entries within painted a picture of a woman struggling with deep isolation and emotional distress. Pages upon pages were filled with reflections on a life lived in solitude. But there were also darker thoughts written between the lines. Camilla's writing suggested a mind in turmoil, obsessed with the passing of time and her perceived neglect by the outside world. The discovery of these journals, along with the other hidden items, caused the authorities to reconsider everything they knew about Camilla. No longer just a quiet, eccentric neighbor, the woman they thought they knew was now shrouded in mystery. The journals indicated a person who had been battling inner demons for years, but to what extent Camilla had been suffering, no one could yet fully understand. As the investigation continued, the community too began to feel the ripple effects of the discovery. People who had once dismissed Camilla as an enigmatic figure now questioned everything they thought they knew about her. The once peaceful village found itself embroiled in an unsettling situation, with whispers of what had been discovered spreading like wildfire. The garden shed, once a place of mere storage, had become the focal point of an investigation that no one in the village had anticipated. What had started as a simple check on a neighbor's well-being had now turned into a haunting discovery that would continue to reverberate throughout the community. In the weeks that followed, the authorities began to piece together Camilla's life from the contents of the shed. But the more they uncovered, the more questions arose. Why had Camilla kept her suffering so hidden? And what had driven her to retreat so deeply into the confines of her garden shed, away from the world that had once known her? The answers, it seemed, lay buried in the many layers of personal items she had left behind, waiting to be discovered. Camilla had always been an enigma to those who lived around her. To the villagers, she was a figure who, despite her quiet, solitary existence, seemed to carry an air of mystery. Few truly knew her, and even fewer could claim to have formed any deep connection with her. She lived in a house on the outskirts of the village, on a plot of land that bordered a small stretch of woodland. Her cottage, though humble, stood in stark contrast to the sprawling estates of some of the other villagers. Still, it had its own charm. The ivy that crept up the stone walls, the wildflowers that thrived in the untended corners of her garden, and the sense of isolation that hung in the air, all seemed to create a picture of a woman who preferred to live apart from the hustle and bustle of everyday life. For years, Camilla had been a familiar yet distant presence in the village. She didn't attend social events, and she rarely engaged in the day-to-day chatter of the marketplace or the gatherings at the local pub. Instead, she kept to herself, often seen tending to her garden or walking the quiet lanes that wound through the outskirts of the village. When she did speak to others, her conversations were brief and polite, but she always seemed to carry a certain unease, a feeling that she wasn't entirely comfortable in her own skin. There was something about her that suggested she was hiding from the world, though no one could put a finger on what it might be. Her life before the village was a topic of much speculation among the locals. Some believed she had once been married, while others thought she had come to the area after a difficult breakup. There were even rumors that she had once been part of a wealthy family, but had left behind the comforts of privilege to live a life of quiet solitude. But whatever the truth was, Camilla never seemed inclined to share it. She lived in a small house filled with worn furniture and old books, and her days were spent tending to her garden, which she clearly adored. Her neighbors would sometimes see her walking to the market with a basket of fresh produce, and while she was always courteous, there was an unmistakable distance in her demeanor, as if she was always careful not to reveal too much. In the village, there were always those who preferred to stay on the sidelines of life, observing from a distance without ever truly becoming a part of things. Camilla was one of those people. She had no close friends, no regular visitors, and no one to confide in. But that too was part of her charm. Her ability to remain a quiet observer, to blend into the background while keeping her own secrets locked away from prying eyes. It was a lifestyle that suited her, and for years, the village had accepted her as one of its more peculiar residents. She was a part of the community, but she never fully belonged to it. But as time passed, people began to notice subtle changes in Camilla. She appeared less often in the village, her garden became overgrown, and the once pristine windows of her cottage were clouded with dust. The cheery greetings she once exchanged with her neighbors became fewer and farther between. It wasn't unusual for someone to withdraw from society for a time, but with Camilla, her retreat seemed more pronounced. She stopped attending the small gatherings at the local pub, and the trips to the market became even rarer. For the first time in years, her cottage seemed eerily still. Despite these changes, no one thought much of it at first. People assumed that Camilla was simply going through a phase of solitude, something that wouldn't last long. After all, she had always been a private person, and it was entirely possible that she simply needed time to herself. However, when Mrs. Eliza Brooks, one of the few villagers who had ever exchanged more than a passing word with Camilla, noticed that she hadn't seen her in several days, concern started to grow. Mrs. Brooks was a kind-hearted woman, always ready to lend a hand to a neighbor in need, and it was unlike Camilla to disappear without any word. When the silence stretched for more than a week, Mrs. Brooks decided to check on her. Walking down the familiar path that led to Camilla's cottage, Mrs. Brooks felt a sense of unease. The garden, which had always been a source of pride for Camilla, had become overgrown with weeds and wild vines. The air around the cottage felt heavy, as if something was wrong. Mrs. Brooks knocked on the door, but there was no answer. She knocked again, a little louder this time, but still nothing. With growing concern, she tried the door, and to her surprise, it was unlocked. Cautiously, she stepped inside, calling out for Camilla. The silence that greeted her was unsettling. The house, as always, was filled with an odd mix of comfort and neglect. The furniture was worn, the floors creaked beneath her feet, and the air had the faint, musty scent of a home that had been left alone for too long. Mrs. Brooks wandered through the rooms, calling out, but there was no response. Camilla was nowhere to be found. The house felt empty, as though its inhabitant had simply vanished. But there were no signs of a struggle, no indication that anything had been disturbed. It was as if Camilla had simply walked out and never returned. It was then that Mrs. Brooks turned her attention to the garden shed. Though Camilla had never been one to invite others inside her personal space, the shed was an extension of her world. Over the years, Mrs. Brooks had noticed the occasional movement inside, a brief flicker of light or the sound of footsteps. But it had always been a place of quiet solitude for Camilla, where she worked in peace, away from the world. It wasn't unusual for someone who lived alone to spend time in such a space, but the fact that the shed's door was slightly ajar now raised a red flag. It was the last place anyone had thought to look, yet something about it felt important. Mrs. Brooks approached the shed cautiously, peering inside. The space was dim, but she could make out the outlines of various items stacked haphazardly inside. It was at that moment that she felt a wave of discomfort wash over her. Something wasn't right. She decided to call the authorities. The police arrived shortly after, accompanied by a small team of officers. The shed, as they opened the door fully, revealed a scene that none of them could have anticipated. What they found inside was far from what they expected. It wasn't just a collection of tools or gardening supplies. Instead, the shed contained a number of personal belongings, items that appeared to be far more significant than any garden tools or boxes of unused pots. And as they continued to sift through the contents of the shed, they began to uncover a hidden world that had remained out of sight for far too long. Among the clutter, there was a small wooden chest that immediately caught their attention. It was locked, its surface scratched and worn with age. The officers carefully pried open the chest, revealing the first clue to what had been going on inside the shed. Inside, they found journals, dozens of them, stacked neatly in the chest. They were filled with Camilla's handwriting, some of it flowing and elegant, other parts jagged and desperate. The journals spoke of loneliness, of isolation, and of a woman's struggle with her own mind. As they read through the pages, they began to understand that Camilla's retreat into the shed had been more than just a preference for solitude. It had been a way for her to cope with feelings of abandonment, sorrow, and perhaps something deeper. The officers continued their search, uncovering even more unsettling items. Photographs, letters, and personal keepsakes that spoke of a woman who had been living in a state of mental turmoil for years. Camilla had retreated into the shed not just physically, but mentally, as a way to escape from the world and her own struggles. It was clear now that the Camilla the village thought they knew was not the person she had been hiding from them. The more the investigation into Camilla's life unfolded, the more it became clear that what had initially seemed like a case of simple disappearance was something much more profound. The contents of the garden shed, with its journals, letters, and mysterious items, offered only a glimpse into the deeper, more complex nature of her retreat. It wasn't just the solitude she craved. It was a refuge from something far more significant, something tied to her past. As the officers delved further into the shed's contents, they began to uncover a life shaped by struggles, both visible and invisible, and perhaps a secret that had remained buried for decades. The journals themselves were a window into Camilla's inner world. They were filled with reflections on her life, her relationships, and the quiet battles she fought every day. Many of the entries were written in the form of letters to no one in particular, addressing feelings of regret, sorrow, and longing. It was clear that Camilla had experienced considerable emotional trauma, but the nature of that trauma was not immediately obvious. Some pages detailed moments of happiness, fleeting but cherished, while others were filled with pain, as if Camilla was trying to make sense of events she couldn't control. The words were a patchwork of memories, written in the dark of night, a woman's attempt to process a life that had not gone as expected. As the officers continued to read through the journals, they discovered references to people who had come and gone from Camilla's life, though none of the names were familiar to those investigating her. One name, in particular, seemed to appear frequently: James. From the context of the writings, it was clear that James had been a central figure in Camilla's life at some point, though the relationship was not entirely clear. Some entries spoke of deep affection, while others hinted at conflict and heartbreak. The intensity of these entries suggested a relationship that had left a significant impact on Camilla, but it was not until later that the full story of James would begin to unravel. The discovery of the journals opened up new questions, ones that the officers were eager to investigate. What had happened between Camilla and James? Why had she kept these journals hidden away in the garden shed, away from the eyes of the people around her? It seemed that these personal reflections were not just an attempt to work through emotions. They were a testament to a life that had been shaped by loss, by choices made, and by the isolation that had become Camilla's norm. But it wasn't just the journals that held significance. Among the items in the shed, there were also photographs, dozens of them, all of people Camilla had known at various points in her life. Some of the faces were unfamiliar, but others seemed to have played a more central role in her story. There were pictures of Camilla as a young woman, taken in what appeared to be happier times, as well as more recent photos that seemed to show a person who had become withdrawn, disconnected from the world around her. These photographs were a window into a past that Camilla had never shared with the villagers, a life that had been hidden away, possibly even from herself. The most unsettling discovery, however, was a small, weathered box hidden beneath a pile of old gardening tools. Inside the box, wrapped in a faded piece of cloth, was a collection of items that appeared to be of great sentimental value to Camilla. The contents included a gold ring, worn and scratched with age, as well as a set of letters tied with a ribbon. The letters were written in a beautiful script, the kind of handwriting that suggested they had been written by someone deeply in love. But what caught the attention of the officers was the return address on the letters, a place far from the village, a location that would become pivotal in the unfolding investigation. The name on the envelope, James Warwick, meant nothing to the officers at first. But as they examined the contents of the letters more closely, a picture began to emerge. The letters were filled with declarations of love, promises of a future together, and references to a shared life that was never realized. As they read through the correspondence, it became apparent that these letters were the last remnants of a love affair that had been tragically cut short. The emotions conveyed in the letters were raw, filled with longing and heartache. It was clear that Camilla had held on to these memories, keeping them locked away as a testament to a love that could never be. The officers were stunned by the contents of the box. It seemed that the life Camilla had built for herself in the village, her quiet retreat from the world, was not the whole story. Beneath her outward appearance of calm and solitude, there was a woman who had experienced love, loss, and heartbreak in ways that the villagers could never have imagined. The discovery of the letters to James Warwick was just the beginning. As the investigation continued, the officers would uncover more about this man, and the connection between him and Camilla would begin to reveal itself in ways they had not anticipated. At this point, the investigation shifted into a new phase. The officers now knew that Camilla's story was tied to something larger than her withdrawal from the village. Her past was interwoven with a love that had shaped her choices, her actions, and perhaps her decision to retreat into isolation. But the real questions were just beginning to surface. Why had Camilla chosen to live in such seclusion? What had happened to James Warwick? And most importantly, what had driven her to keep such a significant part of her life hidden from everyone around her? The officers began their search for answers, reaching out to those who might have known James Warwick, trying to piece together the story of this mysterious man. What they found was a tale that stretched back many years, to a time when Camilla had been much younger, more vibrant, and full of hope. James, it turned out, had been a figure from Camilla's past who had disappeared under circumstances that were still unclear. Some claimed that he had left the area suddenly, without explanation, while others said that he had died in a tragic accident, but no one could say for certain what had happened to him. The only thing that was clear was that Camilla had never fully recovered from his absence. Her journals and letters spoke of a woman who had been deeply affected by the loss of James, a loss that she had carried with her for years. As the investigation deepened, it became apparent that James Warwick had been the key to understanding Camilla's retreat from society. But the question remained, what had happened to him? And why had Camilla kept so much of her past locked away in the garden shed? The answers, it seemed, were buried in the past, buried in the secrets of a woman who had spent years hiding from the world she had once known. The officers, after making their initial discoveries in the shed, had delved into every aspect of Camilla's past they could find. They reached out to former acquaintances, neighbors, and even people from her childhood, hoping to piece together the puzzle of who Camilla truly was. What they found was a woman whose life, much like the contents of the shed, was layered with complexity, contradictions, and unresolved emotions. Some of those who knew her spoke of a young woman filled with dreams, aspirations, and love, while others described a more withdrawn, enigmatic figure, one who had distanced herself from the world in an attempt to escape the pain of the past. It quickly became apparent that Camilla had not always been the quiet, reclusive person she was now. In her youth, she had been full of life, socializing with people from all walks of life and participating in various events. Those who had known her at the time remembered her as being vibrant, charming, and full of potential. Yet, as time passed, something changed. The carefree young woman was gradually replaced by a more reserved, solitary figure. It was almost as though she had retreated into herself, choosing to disconnect from the world around her. The catalyst for this transformation was still unclear, but many suspected that it had something to do with her deep and seemingly unresolved emotional ties to the past. While some of the people who knew her hinted at a broken relationship, none could provide any solid details about the man named James Warwick. He remained an elusive figure, mentioned only in passing, as though his presence in her life had been a shadow that had loomed large and then disappeared just as suddenly. The few who had known of him said little, offering only vague stories of his charm and their deep connection. It was as though the memory of him had been deliberately erased from her life by those around her. But why? What had happened to James? And why had Camilla never fully opened up about him to anyone, even those who had been closest to her? The investigation into James Warwick's disappearance began in earnest. The officers learned that he had been part of a small circle of friends that Camilla had kept for many years. But after a certain point, he simply vanished from the scene. No one knew exactly where he had gone or what had happened to him. Some speculated that he had moved abroad, while others believed that he had died in a tragic accident. The truth, however, was much more complicated than anyone had anticipated. Through their inquiries, the officers discovered that James had been involved in some questionable activities before his disappearance. There were rumors of financial troubles, potential legal issues, and even whispers of dangerous associations that he had been involved in. But even as these rumors surfaced, it was clear that no one knew the full extent of what had happened. James's life, like so many of Camilla's memories, had been carefully hidden away, tucked into the corners of the past, where no one dared to look too closely. The more the officers uncovered, the more they realized that Camilla's relationship with James had been far more significant than they had originally thought. It was not just a passing affair or a fleeting romance. It seemed to have been a defining part of her life, one that had shaped her choices, her actions, and the way she interacted with the world around her. The emotional intensity of the letters she had written to him, along with the journals that described their shared moments of love and loss, revealed a woman who had been deeply affected by the events surrounding James. But what had happened to him? Why had he disappeared without a trace? And why had Camilla never spoken of him again? In an attempt to find answers, the officers spoke with those who had been closest to Camilla during the years following James's disappearance. One of them, a longtime friend who had known her well, spoke about the toll it had taken on Camilla when James was no longer part of her life. According to the friend, Camilla had been devastated by his sudden absence, and it marked the beginning of her withdrawal from society. But even this friend could offer no concrete answers as to what had truly happened to James. He had simply disappeared, leaving behind nothing but unanswered questions. As the investigation progressed, the officers began to piece together a picture of Camilla's emotional state at the time. It became clear that her retreat into solitude had not been an easy decision. Rather than seeking out the company of others to ease her pain, Camilla had chosen to withdraw, retreating to the garden shed where she could keep her thoughts and memories to herself. The letters, the journals, the photographs, these were her way of holding on to the past, of keeping a piece of her former self alive. But why had she chosen to keep all of this so carefully hidden from everyone around her? What was it about James and their relationship that made it so important, so central to her emotional world, that she couldn't bear to let go of it? As the investigation dug deeper, the officers began to suspect that Camilla's choice to live in seclusion had been a way of coping with something far more troubling than the loss of a lover. It was as though she had been trying to protect herself from something darker, something that had left an indelible mark on her psyche. The more they uncovered, the more they realized that Camilla's life had been shaped by a series of choices that had led her to this point of isolation. In their efforts to understand Camilla's motives, the officers turned their attention to the one person who might have had the answers all along, Camilla herself. But as they attempted to speak with her, they found that she was still unwilling to open up about the past. She had become a master at deflecting questions, redirecting conversations, and keeping her emotions carefully guarded. It seemed that, for all her years of seclusion, Camilla had perfected the art of maintaining her privacy. At this point, it became clear that the contents of the garden shed were not just remnants of a forgotten past. They were symbols of a life that Camilla had never fully come to terms with. The emotional weight of her past, her relationship with James, and the choices she had made to distance herself from the world were all locked away in the pages of those journals in the corners of that shed. But despite all the efforts to uncover the truth, one thing remained certain: Camilla's story was far from over. In fact, it seemed that the more the officers uncovered, the more questions they had, and the deeper the mystery surrounding her life became. The shed, once seen as a simple structure, had turned out to be a critical piece of the puzzle. It was a physical manifestation of Camilla's emotional journey, a place where she had sought solace, and where she had kept the remnants of a life that no one had ever truly understood. What had started as a search for missing items had become a search for understanding, a search to uncover the layers of a woman's soul, a woman who had been hiding her truths from the world for far too long. And as the investigation continued, it became increasingly clear that the answers Camilla held might not only explain the secrets of her past, but also the future she was still trying to navigate. The contents of the shed, once thought to be insignificant, were now under intense scrutiny. Each letter, journal, and photograph uncovered painted a more vivid picture of Camilla's personal history. However, these pieces of evidence did not provide the full picture. As investigators pored over her past, they realized that the items in the shed were just the tip of the iceberg. Beneath the surface, there was a woman who had lived through hardship, love, loss, and emotional turmoil. A woman whose life had been shaped by a complex mix of personal choices and circumstances beyond her control. While much of the focus had been on the physical items found in the shed, it was the emotional weight they carried that truly held significance. Camilla's life had been marked by tragedy, particularly the loss of James Warwick, the man who had seemingly disappeared from her life without a trace. The letters that detailed their passionate relationship, along with the journals that chronicled their shared moments of love and sorrow, revealed a woman whose heart had been broken in ways that most people would never understand. It was clear that James had been a pivotal figure in her life, one whose absence had left a gaping hole in her emotional world. However, the mystery surrounding James's disappearance remained unsolved. The officers working on the case had done their best to track down any information about him, but the trail had grown cold. No one seemed to know where he had gone or what had happened to him. Some speculated that he had simply left Camilla behind and moved on with his life, while others believed that something far more sinister had occurred. As the investigation into his disappearance continued, the questions surrounding his fate became even more pressing. Had James simply chosen to vanish from Camilla's life, or had something more nefarious forced him into the shadows? The search for answers took the officers deeper into Camilla's past. They began to interview people who had known her before James had disappeared, hoping to uncover more clues about her emotional state during that time. It was during these interviews that they began to hear whispers of a darker side to Camilla's personality, one that had been hidden from public view. Several individuals described her as a woman who had been haunted by something she couldn't escape, someone who had turned inward and retreated from the world after losing James. These accounts painted a picture of a woman who was not merely reclusive, but was also struggling with deep emotional pain. As the investigation moved forward, the officers uncovered even more troubling information about Camilla's life. They learned that, after James's disappearance, she had become increasingly withdrawn, cutting off ties with many of her old friends and acquaintances. She had retreated into the solitude of her home and, most notably, into the garden shed, where she kept the letters and journals that now seemed to tell a story of love, heartbreak, and regret. It was clear that, for Camilla, the shed had become a refuge, a place where she could preserve the memories of a past she could never fully let go of. But what had really happened to James? The officers began to explore the possibility that his disappearance was linked to something more sinister, something that Camilla herself may have been involved in. They delved into his background, uncovering details about his life that had been hidden away. It turned out that James had been involved in a number of questionable activities before his sudden disappearance, and there were whispers of connections to dangerous individuals and criminal organizations. Had Camilla been aware of these connections? Did she know more about James's disappearance than she had ever let on? As the investigation progressed, the officers began to piece together a timeline of events leading up to James's disappearance. They learned that, in the weeks before he vanished, James had become increasingly paranoid. He had spoken to several friends about feeling as though he was being watched, and he had mentioned that he feared for his life. The officers also uncovered evidence suggesting that James had made arrangements to leave town in a hurry, though no one could say exactly why. Had he been trying to escape from something? Or, someone? One of the more unsettling revelations came when the officers discovered that, just days before his disappearance, James had written a letter to Camilla, expressing his concerns about his safety. In the letter, he mentioned that he had discovered something he wasn't supposed to know, something that had put him in grave danger. However, before he could reveal any details about what he had uncovered, the letter abruptly ended, leaving many questions unanswered. The contents of this letter, along with the other evidence the officers had gathered, pointed to the possibility that James's disappearance had not been a simple case of him walking away from his life, but rather something much darker. As the investigation continued, the officers' focus shifted from merely uncovering the details of James's disappearance to understanding the broader implications of what had been hidden for so many years. It became clear that Camilla had been living with the burden of these secrets for much longer than anyone had realized. The emotional toll had shaped every aspect of her life, from her relationships with others to her decision to live in isolation. What had started as a quest to understand the contents of a garden shed had evolved into a much deeper exploration of Camilla's soul, a journey into the heart of a woman who had been carrying a weight far heavier than anyone could have imagined. The investigation into James Warwick's disappearance and Camilla's emotional journey was not just about uncovering a series of events from the past. It was about understanding the complex interplay of love, loss, guilt, and redemption. As the officers worked tirelessly to unravel the mystery, they began to realize that the truth about Camilla and James might never be fully known. Some things, they suspected, were simply too painful to face, even after all these years. In the end, the contents of the garden shed had not only revealed the secrets of Camilla's past, but had also forced the world to confront the complicated nature of love and loss. Camilla's life had been shaped by choices that had led her down a path of secrecy and solitude, and the discovery of the shed was a symbolic moment in her journey toward redemption. But whether or not Camilla would ever fully embrace the truth of her past, and whether the world would ever truly understand her, remained a question that may never be answered. For now, the mystery of James Warwick's disappearance and Camilla's emotional scars remained unsolved, locked away in the shadows of the past. As time went on, it became clear that some stories, no matter how hard we try to uncover them, remain hidden in the dark corners of our lives, waiting for the right moment to come to light. But for Camilla, the journey was far from over. The search for answers continued, and in the end, it would be her own decision to reveal the truth, or keep it buried forever.